The typewriter stood at the edge of the workbench like an artifact of a quieter world. Its chrome keys caught the dull glow of a single bulb that swung gently above it. Outside, London's night trembled under the wail of sirens. Somewhere in the distance, another bomb fell, a faint concussion that rolled across the dark fields and rattled the window panes. Dr. Harold Keene didn't look up. He had stopped reacting to the sounds of war weeks ago. He was an engineer, not a soldier, and for him the real battle took place under the soft hum of electricity and the smell of oil. It was February 1940. The country was exhausted. Factories ran without rest, trains carried weapons and coal instead of people, and the sky above Britain was alive with searchlights. But here, in a quiet wing of Bletchley Park, a different kind of war was being fought, a war of codes, numbers, and human endurance. The British cipher machine, Typex, had served well so far. But word had reached the intelligence service that the Germans were upgrading Enigma. Every few weeks, their encryption patterns changed, faster than the Allies could decode them. Each new rotor, each extra plugboard connection, turned messages into unbreakable noise. At Bletchley, mathematicians and linguists worked in endless shifts, translating fragments of intercepted transmissions. But engineers like Keene faced another problem: how to build a system secure enough to protect Britain's own messages. The order came down through channels so secret that even the messengers didn't know their meaning. Develop a cipher method that leaves no trace, one that hides as something ordinary. Keene studied the note, the paper slightly damp from the courier's breath. A code that hides as something ordinary. The phrase wouldn't leave his mind. On his desk sat an old Remington No. 2 typewriter. Its paint was worn to the metal where hundreds of hands had once typed letters, reports, requisition forms. Now it stood useless, half-broken, its ribbon torn. And yet when Keene pressed one key, the motion, the clack, the rebound, the smooth alignment of levers struck him as something precise, almost mathematical. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "What if you could hide a message inside your own rhythm?" That night, while others in the barracks tried to sleep through the noise of bombers, Keene began dismantling the machine. Piece by piece, he removed screws, springs, and arms until only the frame remained. Then he started again, this time rebuilding it with a purpose no secretary could have imagined. He believed he could transform its mechanical motion into a cipher, a system where every keystroke generated an electrical impulse, passing through rotating contacts and producing a new, unpredictable output each time. A typewriter that didn't just print words, but disguised them. The next morning, his supervisor, Colonel Travis, walked in. "What's this supposed to be, Doctor?" he asked, looking at the stripped-down machine. Keene didn't stop working. "A backup encryption system, one that looks like nothing." Travis raised an eyebrow. "You plan to win the war with office furniture?" Keene smiled faintly. "If it fools the enemy, sir, yes." Travis studied him for a moment. "You have 30 days. Then he turned and left. That single sentence was all the permission Keene needed. He worked through nights and mornings without distinction. When the air raid sirens started, he merely dimmed the lamp to hide the light. He rewired telephone relays scavenged from a bombed-out post office, soldered them to the frame, and ran thin copper wires across the machine's spine. The metal smelled of heat and flux, the air of dust and fatigue. Joan Clarke found him there 3 days later, still in the same clothes, his fingers blackened by oil. She was a young cryptanalyst, quiet, sharp, and unflinchingly logical. She looked at the mess of parts and paper. "Another experiment?" she asked. Keene didn't look up. "A solution." He tapped a key. A letter appeared on the page. "E." He tapped again. "G." The sequence was wrong, yet perfectly deliberate. Joan frowned. "You're making mistakes." Keene smiled, tired but certain. "No, the machine is. That's how it hides the truth." She didn't understand at first, but when he explained the concept, that each keystroke changed the electrical path of the next, her eyes widened slightly. "It's alive," she said softly. That word stayed with him. They worked together after that, eating ration biscuits and drinking tea gone cold before it reached the lips. Every day was the same. Test, fail, adjust, test again. The machine hummed like a quiet heart between them. Outside, the world collapsed and rebuilt itself daily. Inside, time dissolved into the rhythm of keys. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Joan asked, "Do you think anyone will ever know about this? What we're building?" Keene paused, his hand still on the carriage. "If it works," he said, "they'll never need to." Weeks passed before they had their first success. The phrase they used was simple: "The fox runs at dawn." The machine spat out nonsense, a jumble of letters that meant nothing. But when reversed through the same mechanism, the phrase returned, perfect and whole. Joan exhaled sharply. "It works." Keene stared at the paper, then looked at her. "Then so do we." That night, word came that Coventry had been bombed again. Factories gone. Hundreds dead. Keene didn't speak. He just sat there, his hands resting on the cold metal of the machine. For the first time, the silence felt heavier than any sound. "Joan," he said finally, "sometimes I think we build these machines for people who won't live to use them." She didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Days later, a wooden crate stood in the corner of the lab. Stamped on it were 2 words: "Top Secret." Inside was the typewriter. Keene signed the transport papers and followed the truck to London. Fog swallowed the road. The headlights cut narrow tunnels through it. At a checkpoint, a young soldier asked what was inside. "Typewriter," Keene said simply. The guard nodded, never guessing that inside that box lay a new kind of weapon, one built from patience, metal, and silence. When they reached the city, the air still smelled of smoke and fear. Keene delivered the crate to MI8 headquarters, handed over the documents, and turned to leave. A clerk stopped him. "What do we call it, sir?" He thought for a moment. "It's still a typewriter," he said. "It just writes differently." That night, back at his quarters, he opened his notebook and drew the diagram again. He labeled every wire, every path of current. Then beneath it, he wrote 4 words: "Hiding truth in plain sight." Outside, bombers droned overhead, their engines distant but steady. He blew out the candle and closed the book. "If it works," he whispered, "they'll never know it existed." The fog over London had not lifted for 3 days. It rolled over the streets like smoke that had forgotten where the fire was. Inside the walls of MI8 headquarters, the war felt distant and near all at once, distant in its chaos, near in its silence. Dr. Harold Keene stood beside the crate that held his invention. It had been transported from Bletchley Park under armed escort, as if it were made of gold rather than steel and wire. He had not slept since it left his workshop. Now, in this sterile room filled with the scent of ozone and polished floors, he felt both proud and uneasy. 2 officers in gray uniforms entered the room, accompanied by a civilian engineer from the signals branch. They said little. The engineer pointed to the crate. "This the machine?" Keene nodded. They pried open the lid. Inside, the typewriter gleamed dully under the overhead light. Ordinary, almost disappointingly so. One of the officers smirked. "That's your miracle device?" Keene ignored the tone. "Appearances deceive," he said quietly. He set the machine on the table and connected its power unit. Every motion was careful, deliberate, a craftsman's ritual. When he pressed the first key, the relay clicked once. A light flickered. Letters began to appear on the page, nonsensical at first, yet perfectly ordered in their own strange logic. The men leaned in. One whispered, "It's gibberish." Keene reversed the current and ran the output through again. A moment later, the nonsense turned into a phrase. "The fox runs at dawn." No one spoke. The engineer from Signals finally said, "It works." The officer beside him asked, "Can it be disguised?" Keene's answer came instantly. "It already is." He demonstrated how easily the wires could be hidden, how the casing could pass for a civilian typewriter. He explained that even if the Germans captured one, they would never guess its purpose. There were no dials, no cogs, no clear system to analyze. One of the officers exchanged a glance with the other. Then he said simply, "Approved." Keene stood still as they wrote notes into their files. No one congratulated him. No one shook his hand. His machine was now property of the British government. And yet, as he watched it hum faintly on the table, he realized it was no longer his. The journey back to Bletchley Park was quiet. The countryside passed by in shades of gray. When he arrived, Joan Clarke was waiting near the entrance, holding a clipboard and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "They said it worked," she said. He nodded. Her smile was brief, not joy, but relief. They walked back to the workshop together. The air smelled of dust and oil, familiar and grounding. For the first time in weeks, he felt at home. Joan glanced at him. "Will they use it?" "They will," he said. "But not the way we intended." "What do you mean?" Keene paused, his gaze drifting to the window where the evening light bled through a crack in the blackout curtain. "It was built to protect messages. They'll use it to disguise them, to mislead, to lie." Joan's expression tightened. "Isn't that what war is?" He didn't answer. He only switched on the lamp and began adjusting the spare components laid out on the bench. Weeks turned into months. Keene was ordered to create 3 more prototypes for field use. He refined the design. Faster relays, lighter housing, more stable current flow. The sound of the machine had changed, too. Softer now, more rhythmic, almost like breathing. Joan often stayed late, helping him test transmission accuracy. She had learned to read his silence, to understand when his mind was racing or when it had stopped entirely. Sometimes, between tests, she would glance up and say something small just to keep him tethered to the world outside the circuitry. "You should sleep," she'd tell him. He would reply, "So should you." But neither did. One night, the power flickered. A distant explosion shook the windows. The test paper in the carriage trembled. Keene pressed his hand on it to steady it. The ink smudged under his fingers, leaving a dark line across the words. He looked at it and murmured, "Even ink remembers." Joan didn't ask what he meant. By March, the prototype passed every field requirement. It could encrypt and decrypt faster than any rotor machine, without the need for mechanical maintenance. It was simple enough for a single operator to use, and small enough to hide inside a suitcase. Keene received a letter from the ministry. Production approved. Deployment to begin immediately. Below that, in smaller type, a sentence that made his stomach tighten. "All further correspondence regarding Project Typewriter will remain classified." He folded the letter neatly and put it in his jacket pocket. That evening, as he walked through the compound, he heard laughter from one of the huts. Young code breakers celebrating a decrypted Enigma message. He smiled faintly. They would never know that another kind of secret had just been born in silence. A week later, he was summoned again to London. This time the meeting took place in a windowless room lit by a single lamp. A senior intelligence officer sat across from him, his tone crisp, impersonal. "Your invention will be used in occupied territories," he said. "Our agents will carry it disguised as standard typewriters. If captured, they'll claim it's for clerical work." Keene nodded slowly. "And if they don't survive?" "Then the device will. That's all that matters." Keene looked down at his hands. The officer continued. "You understand the nature of your contribution?" "I do," he said quietly. "It hides truth in plain sight." The officer closed the folder. "Good. History won't remember this conversation." When the meeting ended, Keene stepped into the cold corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and for a moment the sound reminded him of the typewriter's hum. He realized the two were the same, machines that spoke without words. Back at Bletchley, Joan was working alone, decoding intercepted traffic. Her pencil moved quickly across the page, marking letters, symbols, and probabilities. When Keene entered, she didn't look up. "They've started production, haven't they?" He nodded. She pushed the paper aside and faced him. "Are you proud of it?" He hesitated. "Pride doesn't fit here," he said. "Only precision." Joan stood and walked to the machine, resting under its cover. She lifted the cloth, revealing the keys, the polished frame, the faint burn marks from his soldering iron. Her voice was soft. "Do you ever think about what happens when we build something too perfect?" Keene met her eyes. "All the time." That night, long after the compound lights had gone dark, he returned to the lab. The air was still. He sat in front of the typewriter, fingers hovering above the keys. He typed one line, not for any report, not for any superior, just for himself. Truth is safest when it sounds ordinary. He tore the paper from the roller and folded it twice. Then he slid it beneath the machine's metal plate, where no one would ever look. For a moment he thought he heard it, the faint rhythm of the machine breathing in the dark. Then he realized it wasn't the typewriter at all. It was his own pulse. He smiled faintly, turned off the lamp, and left. Behind him, in the quiet, the machine waited. And if anyone had stood in that empty room, they might have sworn that one of the keys, just one, moved ever so slightly, as though the typewriter were dreaming. By the spring of 1942, the machine had vanished from Bletchley Park. No one spoke of it anymore. The benches where it once stood were empty, dust settling over forgotten blueprints. Dr. Harold Keene still came to work, but something inside him had gone quiet, a silence too deliberate to be peace. Rumors moved like wind through the huts. A new message system was being used in occupied France, one the Germans couldn't trace. Reports came from the field of coded transmissions sent from behind enemy lines using an ordinary typewriter. Keene recognized the phrasing immediately. He didn't need confirmation. His invention was out there. At first, the news brought a strange pride. Each successful transmission meant lives saved, resistance strengthened. But pride turned to unease when the first failure arrived. An agent had been captured near Rouen, his equipment confiscated. The German report, intercepted weeks later, mentioned an unusual typing device with strange wiring. They had dismissed it as an improvised repair. The agent never came back. Keene read the report twice. His hands trembled slightly. "It worked," he whispered to himself. "Even in death, it worked." Joan found him standing by the window, staring at the rain on the glass. "You've read it," she said quietly. He nodded. She placed a hand on his arm. "It's not your fault." But fault was a word that engineers understood too well. Every circuit, every failure had a cause. If the machine could not protect the man who used it, then its perfection meant nothing. That night, Keene returned to his quarters and stared at his hands. They were steady. Too steady. He wished they would shake or falter or feel something other than calculation. In April, he was summoned to London again. This time, the letter bore an American seal. A liaison officer from the newly formed OSS wanted to meet. His name was Captain Edwin Parker. Tall, self-assured, with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Dr. Keene," Parker began, "your work has impressed our people. Washington wants to adapt your design. We think it could revolutionize field communications. Portable, fast, invisible." Keene studied him. "Invisible is dangerous." "That's what makes it valuable," Parker replied. He leaned forward. "You've given us a machine that can speak without being heard. We intend to make sure it never stops speaking." Something in the man's tone felt wrong, too casual, too certain. Keene said nothing. He signed the documents placed in front of him because he knew resistance was pointless. The machine no longer belonged to him. It belonged to governments, to war, to necessity. When he returned to Bletchley, Joan was waiting near the gate. Her expression said she already knew. "They're taking it, aren't they?" "Yes," he said, "across the Atlantic, to make it better." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then it's no longer ours." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that ideas could not be owned. But even that would have been a lie. Weeks passed. The air grew warmer, the sky clearer. But something in Bletchley Park felt heavier. Intercepted German traffic showed a new pattern, irregular yet familiar. It mimicked the pulse of his typewriter's code. The realization came slowly, like a splinter pushing through skin. One evening, as he examined a captured message, he froze. The relay intervals, the rhythm, identical. Someone on the other side had learned from his design. The enemy was now speaking in his language. He took the papers to Colonel Travis. The older man listened, his face unreadable. "You're certain of this?" "Yes, sir, it's mine. The timing, the sequence, no one else would think to use that alignment." Travis leaned back in his chair. "Then we have a problem." Keene's voice was calm, but his eyes were tired. "We have a betrayal." The investigation that followed was quiet and brief. Files were reviewed, names checked, correspondence sealed. No culprit was found. The Americans denied any mishandling of the design. The British denied sharing it. And yet, the pattern continued to appear in German signals. Keene stopped sleeping. He stayed in the lab long after others had gone home. Some nights he didn't even turn on the light. He would sit in the dark, listening to the rain and the faint ticking of the clock, imagining the rhythm of his machine. He began to wonder if the betrayal hadn't come from outside at all. Maybe it was inevitable, that every invention, no matter how noble, eventually found a darker purpose. A week later, a crate arrived at Bletchley marked with unfamiliar code. Inside was a damaged typewriter, one of his own, recovered from a safe house in Belgium. The paint was scorched, the casing dented, but when he lifted the frame, his breath caught. The internal wiring had been changed. Someone had modified the circuits, improved them. Joan stood beside him as he examined it. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means they understood it," he said softly. "Too well." He traced a line of solder with his finger. The work was precise, elegant. A mind not unlike his own had done this, methodical, curious, relentless. He closed the lid gently. "If they've learned to think like us," he said, "then we've already lost." The next morning he met with Travis again. "This machine must be destroyed," he said firmly. Travis frowned. "Destroyed? Doctor, we've invested." "It's not safe," Keene interrupted. "If the enemy understands its logic, they can reverse it. They can send false orders, intercept our own. It's too dangerous." Travis looked at him for a long time, then nodded slowly. "You built it. You take it apart." And so, in the same quiet room where it had first come alive, Dr. Harold Keene began dismantling his creation, screw by screw, relay by relay. The typewriter lay open before him like an autopsy. The keys, once bright with promise, now seemed heavy, almost accusing. When he crushed the final relay in his hand, he felt a strange relief. It wasn't destruction. It was mercy. He stayed there for hours after the others left, sitting in the glow of a single bulb. His hands were black with grease and ash. The silence around him was so deep it felt like pressure on his chest. And in that stillness, he realized that the only way to keep a secret safe was to make sure it had no voice at all. He opened his notebook, the same one where he had once written equations and dreams, and tore out the pages. One by one, he fed them into the small furnace behind his bench. Each sheet curled and turned to ash. The air smelled faintly of burning ink. He watched until the last ember died, then whispered, "If silence is all that remains, then let it be mine." When he left the room, his footsteps echoed in the corridor like distant keystrokes. No one saw him go. At dawn, Joan found him sitting outside under the pale gray sky. He looked older, though only a night had passed. Beside him, on the bench, lay the empty notebook and a small pile of soot. She sat next to him without a word. After a while, she said softly, "You destroyed it." He nodded. "The world isn't ready for a machine that hides truth too perfectly." She looked towards the horizon where smoke still lingered from the night's bombardment. "Maybe it never will be," she said. Keene turned the empty notebook over in his hands. "The secret of silence," he murmured, "is knowing when to stop speaking." The morning light broke through the mist, washing the courtyard in pale gold. The war went on, indifferent to one man's act of erasure. But somewhere in that quiet hour, something invisible had ended. Not a battle, not a life, but a connection between man and the machine that had learned his language too well. And though the machine was gone, its rhythm stayed with him, a pulse he could still hear when the world was quiet enough. It was the sound of creation remembering its creator, the faint echo of truth, still typing in the dark. When the war ended in 1945, silence returned to Bletchley Park. Not the silence of secrecy or tension, but the strange emptiness that follows victory, a quiet so wide it swallowed every sound that once meant urgency. The huts still smelled of paper and dust, the tables scarred by years of hurried work, the air heavy with what had been hidden for too long. Dr. Harold Keene walked those corridors one last time. He had been ordered to hand in his security pass, return his notebooks, and clear his bench. No farewell ceremony, no photographs, no recognition. The men and women who had saved nations through thought alone were dismissed with simple words. "Thank you for your service. You were never here." He stood for a while in the doorway of his workshop. The bench where his machine had once stood was empty except for a faint rectangle of cleaner wood, the ghost of where history had happened. He ran his hand across it slowly, then gathered what little remained: a single type bar, a cracked relay, a small brass plate with the faint engraving Remington. The fragments fit neatly into a small wooden box. When he closed the lid, it made a sound like the ending of something unfinished. The letter from the ministry arrived a week later. It was brief, courteous, and hollow. "Dr. H. Keene, your wartime appointment is hereby concluded. Your work remains under the Official Secrets Act. You are not to discuss any aspect of it publicly. It was signed by no one. Keene read it twice, then placed it in the box with the relics of the machine. He understood. His greatest achievement would live and die in silence. He left Bletchley on a gray afternoon, the fields outside still showing the faint scars of bomb craters. As the car pulled away, he looked back once at the buildings receding into mist. They seemed smaller now, like secrets that had finally learned how to hide. London, 1946. The city was rebuilding, windows replaced, rubble cleared, new lights blooming where the old had burned out. People laughed again, not easily but determinedly, as if joy were an act of defiance. Keene rented a modest flat near Hampstead Heath. He returned to teaching mechanical design at Imperial College, the same subject he had once left behind for war. His students saw a quiet man with steady eyes and a calm voice, the kind of professor who noticed everything but said little. They never guessed that he had once built a weapon made of silence. Occasionally, during lectures, he would pause mid-sentence, distracted by a sound, the faint clack of a student's typewriter in the back row. It always made him smile, though no one knew why. He kept the wooden box in a drawer in his office. Sometimes he would open it, not to look, but simply to hear the tiny creak of the hinge. It reminded him that what was once real could remain so, even when unseen. In 1948, a delegation of American engineers visited Imperial College. Among them was a familiar face, Captain Edwin Parker, now a civilian. His handshake was firm, his smile unchanged. "Dr. Keene," he said warmly, "it's been a long time." Keene nodded. "I thought our work was over." Parker chuckled. "Work like that never ends. You'll be pleased to know your ideas crossed the ocean. We're developing new cipher systems, smaller, faster, smarter. You started it all." Keene studied him. There was no malice in Parker's tone, no arrogance, only the calm certainty of a man who had turned survival into progress. And yet, something inside Keene tightened. "I didn't start it," he said. "I just made a machine." Parker's smile thinned. "And that's how history begins, with someone who thinks he's only building a machine." He left soon after, leaving Keene alone in the lecture hall. The echo of their conversation lingered in the empty air. Years passed. Students came and went. The world changed faster than he could measure it. Radios gave way to televisions, engines grew quieter, and machines began to think for themselves. Keene kept teaching, but his mind often drifted. He sometimes wrote long letters to Joan Clarke, who had joined GCHQ after the war. Most of her replies were brief and formal, typed on official letterhead. The friendship between them became what all their wartime work had been: coded, disciplined, half-hidden. He never married. He once said, when asked, that his only companion was logic, and that logic never lied to him. In the winter of 1951, a small parcel arrived at his door. No return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a single typewriter key, the letter E. There was a faint burn mark on its edge, as if it had survived fire. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the tiny weight of metal and memory. No note, no message, only that letter. He placed it inside the wooden box, next to the brass plate and the relay. Then he closed the lid. It made the same quiet click it always had. To him, it sounded like a heartbeat that refused to stop. By the late 1950s, new computers filled rooms where typewriters once stood. Men spoke of electronic brains and machine logic. To most, these were marvels. To Keene, they were children, descendants of an idea he had once tried to bury. One evening, after a long day of lectures, he stayed behind in the empty lab. The lights buzzed softly above the rows of new equipment. He sat at a desk and stared at one of the early computing machines. all blinking lights and rotating reels. It was beautiful in a way that frightened him. He reached out and touched its side. The metal was warm. "Be kind to them," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, the machine or whoever would come after him. He died quietly in 1956. No obituary, no ceremony. His few possessions were boxed by the college janitor and sent to storage. Among them the small wooden box, still locked, still unremarkable. It stayed that way for decades. When Bletchley Park was finally declassified in the 1970s, historians arrived with notebooks and cameras, eager to uncover the lost heroes of the secret war. They found documents, reports, and broken machines. And then, one afternoon, in a forgotten archive room of Imperial College, a curator opened a drawer and found the box. Inside were the fragments, the brass plate, the relay, the key marked E. There was also a folded page, yellowed with time. On it, in faint handwriting, 4 words: "Truth, hidden in plain sight." The curator placed the contents on display in a glass case at Bletchley Park Museum. He wrote a small label beneath it: "Unknown Engineer, Bletchley Park, circa 1940. Visitors passed by without stopping. Some leaned in for a moment, curious about the odd machine parts. A few wondered aloud why the label didn't include a name. None of them knew that the man who had built it had once destroyed it to protect the silence it carried." In the late afternoon, when the museum emptied and the lights dimmed, the hall would grow still. The shadows stretched across the floor, soft and slow. And there, under glass, the single key, the letter E, caught the light just enough to gleam. If anyone listened carefully in that quiet, they might have imagined hearing something faint. Not sound exactly, but rhythm. The echo of metal against paper. The whisper of a code that no longer needed to be read. Still typing. Still alive. Still hiding the truth in plain sight.